Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good day, everyone. Welcome to fifth lecture of week 1. This lecture forms an essential part of our exploration into how societies evolve and adapt in an ever-changing global landscape. Before we begin, let me ask you something. When you think of modernization, what comes to your mind? Is it technology, urbanization, or perhaps education reforms? Or do you think of cultural shifts and political transformations? Keep these thoughts in mind as we unravel the theories, examples, and critiques that shape our understanding of modernization. Theories of modernization have evolved over time, with various thinkers offering contrasting perspectives on the relationship between economic development, social change, and global integration. Notable among these theorists are Adam Smith, Karl Polanyi, and the new Marxist thinkers, particularly Andre Gunder Frank, who have shaped critical debates on the topic. Adam Smith, often regarded as the father of classical economics, advocated for a market-driven approach to development. In his seminal work, The Wealth of Nations, Smith argued that economic prosperity could be best achieved through free markets, where individuals pursue self-interest, leading to the invisible hand of the market guiding resources efficiently. Smith's emphasis on industrialization and global market integration laid the groundwork for later modernization theories, which focused on the importance of market economies in driving economic growth and development. The ideas of industrialization and global market integration were central to modernization theory, which often portrayed the path of development as moving toward capitalist market-based economies similar to those of the West. Karl Polanyi offered a contrasting view in his influential work, The Great Transformation, which was published in 1944, in which he critiqued the market-driven development model. Polanyi argued that the rise of market economies in the 19th century disrupted traditional social structures, leading to social dislocation and erosion of communal values. He introduced the concept of the double movement, where societies initially embraced market economies but then sought to reassert social protections and welfare to counter the negative consequences of unregulated markets. Polanyi's critique highlighted that the unrestrained expansion of market economies, as promoted by classical economics and later by modernization theories could lead to significant social instability and inequality. In the 1960s and 1970s, neo-Marxist theorists, particularly Andre Gunder Frank, critiqued modernization theory through the lens of dependency theory. Frank argued that underdeveloped countries were trapped in a cycle of exploitation by developed nations, perpetuating their dependency and underdevelopment. He contended that the global capitalist system created a structure where rich countries extracted resources and labor from poor countries, preventing the latter from achieving true economic independence or development. This perspective directly challenged the idea that all societies could follow a similar trajectory of modernization, suggesting instead that the global system was inherently unequal and exploitative, limiting the development potential of poorer nations. Rostow's stages of economic growth proposed a linear model of development, suggesting that societies must pass through 5 stages to achieve modern economic growth. The pivotal stage is the takeoff, where a society experiences industrialization, investment in productive sectors, and rapid economic expansion. According to Rostow, once a country reaches this phase, it will be on the path to sustained economic growth, leading to higher living standards and modernity. The model is often associated with a Western centric view of development, emphasizing the importance of technological advancement and capital accumulation for societal progress. However, critics of this linear progression, such as Armin and Immanuel Wallerstein, argue that Rostow's model oversimplifies the complexities of development. These scholars challenge the assumption that industrialization leads to autonomy and prosperity, particularly in post-colonial or developing nations. They argue that the global economic system is structured in a way that maintains the dependence of peripheral developing countries on core developed capitalist economies. Dependency theory critiques the notion of takeoff, suggesting that industrialization often results in an increased dependency on global markets and external economic forces rather than fostering true self efficiency. Samir Amin's critique emphasizes the role of multinational corporations and foreign investments in perpetuating dependency, where developing countries exporters of raw materials and labor rather than becoming self-sustaining industrial economies. Immanuel Wallerstein world systems theory expands this idea by framing the global economy as a hierarchical system. The core countries will dominate industrial production and capital flows, exploit the peripheral nations for raw material, labor, and markets. This relationship, according to Wallerstein, ensures that the economic development of peripheral countries is never autonomous but always tied to the interest of core capitalist nations. The Green Revolution in India during the 1960s and 1970s is a key example of these theoretical critiques in action. The Green Revolution introduced high yield crop varieties, chemical fertilizers, and advanced irrigation techniques to boost agricultural productivity. While this transformation led to significant increases in crop production, it also deepened the country's dependence on multinational corporations that controlled the technology, seeds, and chemical necessary for farming. This increased reliance on imported inputs and global markets led to growing disparities between wealthy and poor nations. Large landowners benefited most, while smaller, resource poor farmers were often left behind, exacerbating social inequality. In Latin America, countries like Brazil transitioned to the production of cash crops such as coffee and soybeans to integrate into global trade. While these crops were lucrative in international markets, they subjected local economies to the fluctuations of global commodity prices. As these countries increasingly relied on exports, their ability to achieve food security and self sufficiency was undermined. For example, in Brazil, the focus on cash crops diverted resources away from domestic food production, which in turn led to food scarcity and price instability for local populations. Both the Green Revolution and the shift towards cash crop production in Latin America exemplify the flaws in Rostow's linear model of development. These cases demonstrate that industrialization and modernization processes often fail to reduce dependency, and in many instances they exacerbate inequality and undermine local autonomy. Instead of achieving sustainable economic growth, these regions became increasingly embedded in global capitalist systems that prioritize the interest of wealthy nations and multinational corporations over local self sufficiency and development. We will discuss Everett Roger's diffusions of innovations now. Rogers proposed a theory explaining how, why, and at what rate new ideas and technology spread within a society. He argued that the adoption of technology depends not just on the innovation itself, but on the societal readiness and cultural fit. In other words, a technology is more likely to be adapted if it aligns with the social, cultural, and economic conditions of a community. This challenges modernization theory, which assumed that all societies would follow a similar linear path of development. Modernization theory often assumed that Western models of development could be universally applied without considering local context and cultures. We'll discuss Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. Freire emphasized education as a tool for liberation, especially for marginalized groups. He argued against traditional top-down models of education, which often reflected Western ideologies, and called for a participatory and context-specific approach. Freire believed that education should be rooted in the real experiences and knowledge systems of the community rather than imposing one-size-fits-all curriculum. Freire's work is a critique of Western-centric educational models which often ignore local languages, traditions, and ways of knowing. For example, South Korea's educational reforms. Now, in the 1960s, South Korea focused heavily on science and technology education, which was key to its transformation into a high income economy. The success of the shift in the educational system was partly due to its alignment with societal goals and the global demand for technological innovation. South Korea adapted education to its own economic and social context, allowing it to thrive. In contrast, Afghanistan struggles. Afghanistan has faced challenges in its educational and technological development due to socio-political instability, lack of resources, and the absence of context-specific educational frameworks. The country's development models often relied on external influences that didn't necessarily align with local needs or conditions, hindering sustainable growth. While modern agricultural technologies have been introduced in sub-Saharan Africa, many have failed because they did not match local environmental conditions or traditional practices. In some cases, traditional irrigation methods developed centuries have proven more resilient and effective than newer technologies. This highlights how local knowledge and context specific solutions can be more sustainable than imported ones. Overall, the passage suggests that development and educational models must be tailored to local context, whether through technology adoption or educational frameworks. Simply applying foreign systems without considering the unique cultural, social, and political landscape can lead to failure or inefficiency. Samuel Huntington's Political Order in Changing Societies argues that political stability is essential for modernization, stressing the importance of institution building over immediate democratization. He believed that strong political institutions are needed before societies can successfully transition to modern economies and democratic systems. Antonio Gramsci's theory of cultural hegemony critiques the implicit Western bias in modernization theory. He argued that political reforms often impose dominant cultural ideologies, reinforcing the values and norms of the West while disregarding local traditions and cultures. This highlights the cultural power underlying Western development models. The economic success of the Asian tigers, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, illustrates how centralized, sometimes authoritarian governance can coexist with rapid modernization. These countries achieved impressive growth under strict political control, challenging the notion that democracy is prerequisite for economic development. Rwanda's post-genocide governance focuses on a state-driven modernization exemplified by Vision 2020, which aims to transform the country into a income economy. Despite concerns over political repression, Rwanda has experienced significant economic growth, showing how a controlled top-down approach can lead to progress. In contrast, Arab Spring highlighted the risk of prematurely introducing Western-style democracy. Countries like Libya and Egypt experienced instability after attempts at democratization, revealing that democratization efforts can fail if institutions and social structures are not ready to support change. This underscores the complexity of implementing democracy in politically unstable regions and contrasts with more gradual state-led modernization processes in other contexts. Fukuyama argued that liberal democracy is the ultimate stage of political development, representing the end of history. This aligns with modernization theory, which posits that all societies will eventually follow the same path, often modeled after Western governance systems. Fukuyama's idea suggests that as countries modernize, they will adopt democratic forms of government similar to those found in Western nations, which are seen as the most advanced and stable. In his view, democracy and liberal institutions are seen as natural and inevitable outcomes of social and political evolution. Amartya Sen supported the idea of democracy, but emphasized that it should be participatory, meaning that citizens should have active roles in decision making. He argued that democracy should not be imposed from the outside. It must respect local traditions and be grounded in the context of the people it serves. Additionally, Sen highlighted the core of development is not just economic growth but also freedom, the ability for individuals to live the lives they value. Unlike Fukuyama, Sen is critical of a purely Western model of democracy, emphasizing that each society should develop its own form of governance that is aligned with its culture and values. Let us cite some examples. Ghana's transition to democracy. Now, Ghana's peaceful transition to democracy in the 1990s is often seen as a success story of political reforms. The country managed to balance democratic principles with respect for local traditions, leading to stability and growth. This aligns with Sen's perspective, where democracy was adapted to fit the local context rather than a foreign imposition. Now let's talk a bit about Libya's imposition of Western democratic structures. In contrast, Libya's attempt to transit to democracy after the fall of Gaddafi, especially through Western interventions, led to significant instability and fragmentation. This example illustrates the risk of imposing external democratic systems without considering the local context, which aligns with Sen's critique of top-down democratic models. In summary, Fukuyama's view supports the inevitability of Western-style democracy as a universal endpoint, while Sen advocates for a more flexible, context-sensitive approach that incorporates local traditions and focuses on true freedom and participation. The examples of Ghana and Libya help highlight how these theories play out in practice with varying outcomes based on how local context and traditions are respected or ignored. We'll discuss Edward Said's Orientalism in this context. Said argued that Western powers often portrayed non-Western societies as exotic, backward, and in need of Western intervention and modernization. This portrayal justified imperialism by framing Western values and practices as superior. Said's work critiques this dichotomy, revealing how the West was historically used the concept of cultural stagnation in the East as a way to assert dominance. He argues that this narrative promotes cultural imperialism under the guise of modernization and progress, leading to the marginalization of non-Western ways of life. Bhabha offered a more dynamic view of cultural exchange. Rather than seeing Western culture as replacing or erasing local traditions, Bhabha's theory of hybridity emphasizes that the interaction between cultures led to the creation of new mixed identities. These hybrid identities reflect a blend of local and global influences where cultural exchange doesn't simply result in domination but in transformation and negotiation. Baba suggests that postcolonial societies create new evolving identities rather than passively accepting Western norms. There are some other examples: Western consumer culture in India and Nigeria. The global spread of Western consumerism through media, advertising, and technology has deeply influenced urban lifestyles, especially in countries like India and Nigeria. Fast food chains, fashion trends, and digital technology have become pervasive in urban centers, reshaping everyday life. This presents the diffusion of Western values such as individualism, materialism, and global interconnectedness. However, while these changes may reflect Western influences, they are often adopted and integrated into the local context, showing the complexity of cultural interaction. Bolivia's MS Party and indigenous movement is another example. Bolivia's movement for socialism partly is an example of how indigenous traditions can be integrated into modern political governance. MS advocates for the incorporation of indigenous practices and values within the country's political system, demonstrating that modernization doesn't always mean westernization. In this case, the indigenous movements emphasize the importance of local knowledge and traditional ways of governance, offering an alternative model to Western style democracy. The successful integration of traditional practices into modern politics is an example of how cultural diffusion can work in a way that strengthens rather than erases local values. In summary, while Western influences are undeniable in the globalized world, cultural diffusion is not a simple one way process. Theories like those of Edward Said and Homi Bhabha show that the exchange of cultures leads to complex hybrid outcomes where local cultures can assert agency and reshape global influences to fit their own values and needs. Urbanization refers to the process where populations concentrate in urban areas, fundamentally transforming societal, economic, and environmental dynamics. While it drives modernization and economic growth, it also brings significant challenges such as social inequality, environmental degradation, and infrastructure strain. The sociologist Louis Wirth, writing in 1938, argued that urbanization fosters individuality and social mobility, which are essential for modernization. According to Wirth, cities create opportunities for diverse social interactions and innovation, enabling individuals to break free from traditional hierarchies and move up the social ladder. In contrast, David Harvey, writing in 2008, critiqued unplanned urbanization, emphasizing the negative effects. He highlighted issues like spatial inequality, where access to resources is unevenly distributed across geographic locations, and the marginalization of disadvantaged communities. Harvey viewed profit driven urbanization as a process that often benefits elites while displacing and disenfranchising vulnerable populations, thereby creating long term social and spatial divides. Two real world examples illustrate the contrasting outcomes of urbanization. China's rapid urbanization has been a significant driver of economic growth, yet it has also led to substantial environmental and social challenges, including severe pollution and widening rural urban disparities. In contrast, Curitiba, Brazil offers a model of sustainable urbanization. The city has emphasized inclusive development and green planning, implementing efficient public transportation systems, extensive recycling programs, and public green spaces, which collectively enhance the quality of life for its residents. These examples underscore the need for intentional urban planning to balance the benefits of modernization with the mitigation of its adverse effects. Let's discuss alternative pathways and holistic development. Arturo Escobar's post development theory challenges traditional development paradigms by rejecting universal Western centric models. Instead, Escobar advocates for decolonizing development through localized and participatory approaches that respect the cultural and social specificities of communities. His approach emphasizes the importance of allowing the societies to define their own development paths than adhering to externally imposed frameworks. Amartya Sen's capabilities approach, articulated in 1999, shifts the focus of development from economic matrices like GDP to the enhancement of individual freedom and capabilities. Sen argues that true development is about expanding people's opportunities and enabling them to live the lives they value, prioritizing human well being over purely financial considerations. Two examples illustrate these ideas in practice. Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index represents a holistic model that prioritizes well being, sustainability, and cultural preservation over GDP, aligning with Amartya Sen's emphasis on human centric development. Similarly, Zapatista communities in Mexico have established autonomous governance systems that blend traditional practices with principles of equity and participation, embodying Escobar's call for localized and culturally relevant approaches to development. These examples demonstrate alternative pathways that challenge the dominance of conventional growth focused models. Modernization tools offer structured frameworks for development but are often criticized for being ethnocentric and overly generalized. Rooted in Western experiences, these models frequently assume universal applicability, ignoring the cultural, social, and economic diversity of individual societies. Critics argue that this approach marginalizes local knowledges and fails to address unique challenges. To address these shortcomings, alternative models from critical development studies are proposed. Amartya Sen's capability approach emphasizes enhancing individual freedoms and capabilities like education and health, rather than focusing solely on economic growth. Similarly, Arturo Escobar's cultural critique challenges traditional development models for disregarding local cultures, advocating instead for approaches that respect and incorporate community specific practices and knowledge. Examples from global context illustrate the need for tailored modernization strategies. Societies differ in history, geography, and social dynamics, making one size fit all models ineffective. By integrating alternative theories and recognizing contextual realities, modernization efforts can become more inclusive and sustainable. In conclusion, modernization must reconcile its structured framework with the unique complexities of individual societies. This requires moving beyond ethnocentric models and embracing culturally sensitive, locally relevant approaches that foster equitable and meaningful development outcomes. Thank you.